January of the Common Good podcast. We talk about faith on Wednesdays. Each of our days has a different theme to them in our daily live stream and podcast. And Wednesdays are these exciting days where we ask people of faith to share with us how their faith compels them to the common good. What is it about their convictions, their beliefs, their community of faith that has them care about others and be engaged in the world as a whole? It's actually a really significant question. It's a big question whether your faith should compel you to something collective or to something more interior to your own life, or maybe just to your own group. These are really significant questions that people of all traditions have been asking themselves as we go. It seems to me nothing is more important in the United States, where the role of religion and politics and civic engagement and organizations gets all mixed together. And we have a hard time figuring out sometimes where our faith should start and where it should end. We're launching this whole conversation set today with somebody I'm really excited to be here, Rob Shank, who's Rob. I don't remember, Rob, if you're currently living in D.C. or if you're just in Virginia or Maryland, but we like to tell people where we are. I'm in Minneapolis, you're wherever you are, and we ask people who are watching to tell us where they are and to say hello where they are. So remind me, I think you've recently moved across the river or something. Is that right?
We did, yeah. Cheryl and I were in the district, as we call it, the indigenous peoples of the district call it that, and meaning Washington, D.C. We were in the northeast sector, which was just a lovely place to live. Long established African-American community with deep roots in the District of Columbia and in its history, both the good and the bad. And we really enjoyed living there. But it got a little bit harder over time to navigate the urban setting. And then we knew that a grandbaby was coming and would be in Northern Virginia. So we finally made the painful decision, but now are happily resettled in Alexandria, Virginia.
Okay, in Alexandria.
It has its own rich history.
Sure does. Yeah, it has a lot. Well, in some ways, Robin, I'm going to ask you to share the condensed version of your story, which people can find in your book, Costly Grace, the more extended version of it, and in the film Armor of Light. You tell a bit of it there, so people can pick up your story. But in some ways, you now moving outside of DC also seems to match some other moves of your political life, your work life, your religious occupation, that in some ways, like you're now located in a different place than where you were 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, all the rest of this. So anyway, I find it not every time when someone, has just sort of moved to an adjacent city, is that an interesting part of their biography, but I feel like for yours, it actually might be. So for people who don't know, would you give us the background? I often refer to you as a former right-wing activist, somebody who works in that way, that you were deliberately involved because of your Christian faith in compelling our governments to do and to act in particular ways that many of us would consider to be part of the conservative agenda or the right-wing agenda. And you've moved since then. You've transitioned some, and I think it's interesting, and we'd love to hear a bit of your background as we talk about how your faith now compels you to public and civic common good as compared to what was going on before. So as you've been asked 100 times by me and by others, would you give us a little bit of this biography of the background of Rob Schenck and what brings you to where we are today?
Yeah, well, I share some of that experience with you, Doug. I know you've been through your own pilgrimage in life, and that's inspiring to me. And thank you for your friendship, because it's been very bolstering, very helpful, and at times comforting to me. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I refer to my spiritual journey as one segmented in 3 conversions. I was raised in a nominally Jewish home in Western New York State. And I say nominally, my own family had quite a colorful history. My father, Jewish by birth and upbringing, married my mother, Catholic by birth, Episcopalian by upbringing. By the time they married in the mid 50s, she really had no religious anchor.
Mm-hmm.
So she converted to Judaism in order to assuage the concerns of my father's family, who threatened to uh, uh, reject the marriage and reject him. So it was kind of a conversion of convenience of sorts, but they still raised their 4 children with a basically American Jewish identity. And then in my teens, I met the son of a Methodist minister who introduced me to the person and message of Jesus Christ. I found that very compelling, especially the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' concern for the poor and the marginalized, the forgotten. And that drove me towards the first of my religious conversions when I became a born again Christian. And incidentally,
Mm-hmm.
for the same reasons, cast my first vote for a president of the United States for Jimmy Carter. Why? Because he was a born again Christian and he was concerned about the poor. And that was my introduction to the political arena. But in the mid 80s, by the time I had been to Bible college, had been ordained an evangelical minister, and had taken my seat at the table of national evangelical leadership, I was introduced to a different gospel. And I call it uh, the religion of Ronald Reagan republicanism. Reagan was the first sitting United States president to address a body of evangelical clergy at the annual meeting of the National Association of Evangelicals. I literally had a front seat. I was on the front row of that, felt the presidential aura of affirmation, and got swept up in a very politicized brand of American evangelicalism. And that would characterize the next 30 years of my life and of my work that would eventually land me in Washington, D.C., where I formed an organization called Faith and Action. We defined our mission as a ministry to top elected and appointed officials. I interacted with members of Congress, with more than one presidential administration at the White House, and spent 10 years behind the scenes in face-to-face work with our Supreme Court justices. Our headquarters was immediately across the street from the Supreme Court. So my whole, now let me just be careful to put an asterisk on that. I ministered to Republican political leaders.
Oh, that's
and
interesting. Yeah,
with
yeah.
Republicans, which is an important part of that story. And that put me in a space very far from where I started my spiritual life. And it would take some very painful experiences to bring me to a third conversion. My second conversion was to Ronald Reagan Republican religion. My third conversion was back to the Jesus I had first met in 1974. And that's a different part of the story I can tell if you'd like.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear a bit of that. But fill in some of the color details on what it meant to be someone who was compelled by your faith. I mean, you ran an organization called Faith in Action. You communicated with people of faith. You were using the structures of churches and people's association with religious organizations as a way to find people. So it was definitely a religious impulse. And while I know, because you've shared, and I know from other people's experiences, that the blending of that religious conviction with the political conviction is like making a smoothie. That at some point it all becomes so blended together, it's hard to separate one from the other. But you can tell the flavors, right? Like when you have a breakfast smoothie, you're like, I think I think you put dates in this one. I get the flavor of the day. So you can determine sort of the political from the faith, but they really kind of blend together. As you were thinking back then, and if someone had you on a radio show or a television show, before there were podcasts and so on, back when you're doing this work, and someone had said, "Hey, Rob, how does your faith compel you to the civic life?" How did you answer that question? Did you talk about common good? Did you talk about the systems of structures of power that need to be equally distributed? Like, how did you tell yourself and answer to others about what that role of faith meant to you and how you were doing and living your life and running your organization?
Well, I probably could have stretched it to include the common good, but I didn't. What I would reference, my anchor was um, the moral law of God.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I saw it. And there were certain moral laws
Mm-hmm.
that eclipsed others. So, for example, I was part of the national anti-abortion movement, expressed probably most noticeably in the group Operation Rescue. And we would blockade clinics. We would protest at the homes of abortion providers. We used very acerbic language in our communications about, those who worked at clinics, etc., and eventually even women who sought abortion. Things I deeply regret now. And somehow this fight against legalized abortion became the be all and end all of everything. That would soon be matched by our insistence on a certain configuration for marriage, what we would describe as one man and one woman in lifelong union, period, monogamous union. And that was the only legitimate, and I mean morally and even divinely legitimate configuration of the most intimate of human relationships. So the battle against same-sex marriage became an equal to the battle against abortion. And those two things drove the movement I was a part of. In that, we became so myopic, or maybe that's dualopic, I'm not sure, but in this case,
Nice.
only two things.
Mm-hmm.
And the common good was actually sacrificed to those two things. We weren't looking for the most amount of good for the most amount of people in the most amount of time. It was just these two objectives, and they had to be met even at the cost of everyone else's well-being.
What compelled that? I've talked to a lot of people who have felt that or still feel that way, and I sometimes have the feeling that people are pushing for this moral behavior of the United States so that there's always a "so that" in there, so that the blessings of God would be given to the United States. Like there's a payoff, there's a quid pro quo, you might say, of our behavior versus God's response in people's narratives. Or people don't want to be personally responsible before God themselves for the choices of our government. But it feels like there's some reason why a moral demand, which is then can be rooted in whatever moral activity, whether it's stopping the legality of abortion or not changing the rules of who can be recognized as a married couple, that those, regardless of what the moral action is, the equation seems to exist that something is going to happen if we are more moral in these ways, and something will happen if we're not more moral. Did you ever sort of break it down into a math problem like that? Or was it obvious to you as to what you were pushing for and going for as a movement and a community of people?
Yes. And it was that simple. If we fail to achieve these uh, moral objectives, then we will incur the condemnation of God and his punishment. It was really, the perception of God in those days was as a retributive character.
Mm.
If we didn't do what was right,
Mm-hmm.
then we were in for some ferocious punishment.
Hmm.
And you know, most of the voices that I stood alongside of, for example, Jerry Falwell Sr., in those days, and others like him, would try to, you know, measure that out and maybe even be a bit irenic in our language, but it would leak out. For
Hmm.
example, when Jerry said on national television that AIDS was a punishment from God for our allowance of homosexuality in America. This is not the image of the loving God I was introduced to in John 3:16. For God so loved the world, and by implication, every
Yeah.
human being and every thing in it, animate and inanimate. God loves the world. Uh, but there wasn't a lot of love going on here. There
Yeah.
was, as you suggested, quid pro quo. There was kind of a business relationship, a sort of modus vivendi.
Hmm.
You'll get along okay if you do what I tell you, and if you don't, I squash you.
Yeah.
And that was the fear that kind of framed all of our messaging and all of our actions. So uh, that was what fueled and propelled
Mm-hmm.
us. And it would be coming face to face with that, with the help of my posthumous mentor. You mentioned I'm president now of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute here in Washington, or there in Washington, across the river from where I am now. Um, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, this young, brave, brilliant World War II era pastor, moral philosopher, ethicist, theologian, one of the most brilliant minds of the last century and a half, I would say, helped me
Hmm.
to see that what we were really after here was not God's approval or even the execution of his moral code. It was our own self justification. It
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
I feel better about myself because I see you as worse than me.
Hmm.
And that makes me better. So
Wow.
this was really all about self justification and not concern for the other, certainly not for the common good.
And that is so well said, and I think so crucial to all this conversation about how faith or any other work we do compels us to the common good, because it wouldn't matter where someone is on on the political spectrum of more conservative or more liberal or more libertarian or more unification or wherever they find themselves, right, in a political space. If you're operating under a moralistic contract that our moral behavior will have consequences of the divine or of karma or of the universe, or however you apply the other side of the of the table on the deal, that continues. And in the spaces that I'm involved in, there are days where I get nervous in the more progressive political causes and more progressive faith places where I am, where, boy, it starts to feel and sound an awful lot like what you're describing. And I get nervous, right? That we like call for this. We invoke Martin Luther King Jr.'s great requote of the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So we're invoking morals, that there's moral movements that are going on. That stuff all starts to make me nervous, right? Because the use of that kind of morality and our lives and our faith and our public engagement and our demand upon our political systems, which is the largest system we can all be involved in. Boy, this all, like, to just say, well, if you're more progressive, then that stuff's okay. And if you're more conservative, then I think you're, an extremist, or invert that if somebody's from the other side of the political aisle. It seems to me that your movement, the movement in your own life, your own transitions, or whatever word you want, you use, and I'll ask you what that word is, that you were changing the construct of the deal, not just changing the terms of the deal. In other words, not just changing what's the moral thing and what's the consequence, but really like saying, I don't want to click on that user agreement in my faith for how I'm going to be involved, and I'm trying to find another way. And Bonhoeffer helped you in his writing and his histories, helped you to do that. But can you just talk a little bit about that? I mean, are these concerns that I'm having, are they concerns you also have? Like, when you're in some of these other spaces, do you hear these shadowy reflections of what sounds a lot like your old world? Or I don't know, how does that all land on you?
I do. And one of the surprising discoveries I've made in this new season of life, and a very different one, is that there's such things as progressive conservatives and conservative progressives. And, there are Pharisees, if you will. That's a pejorative term, an unfair pejorative term, because there were actually some really good Pharisees if you read the New Testament a little differently and you look at history. But we use Pharisaical in a pejorative sense. And there are Pharisees on the right and on the left. There are fundamentalists and absolutists on the right and on the left. One of the kind of reintroductions for me to Jesus was seeing him as a revolutionary. He said, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, love your enemy. Love your persecutor. Love the person who opposes you. That changes everything, the foundation and framework to everything. And this is one of the things that attracted me to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I see him as a revolutionary, although, a lot of people think they know Bonhoeffer because they know of his martyrdom. He was murdered by the Nazis for his opposition to Adolf Hitler and his Third Reich dictatorship. And that's a noble part of his story, but it's only a small part of his story, and only came in the literal last hours of his life. If you look at the totality of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the reasons I chose him as the namesake for our new undertaking in Washington is because, first of all, he's equally revered by conservatives and liberals.
Yeah.
And if you examine him, he has conservative impulses and proclivities, and he has very radical, progressive and leftist impulses. He kind of combines those two things. And maybe what you're describing is just the condition of humanity. We are human. And so we make human errors on both sides of the political equation. And it's always finding the different path that is the challenge for everybody, right or left.
Yeah, that's so well said, because I'm starting to conclude in my own larger work that this sort of moral bargaining, and we're going to give ourselves too far to one side or the other, and becoming that these are not problems to be solved in that classic sense. These are conditions that we live with, and they're going to continue to show up. And so A problem, you just apply a solution. A condition, you have multiple responses to a set of conditions. And we find ourselves in a place where we have to respond particularly at certain moments in some ways that might be different than others. I am reminded that, 365 days ago, I had a view of Christian nationalism and Christian role in the world after the election of Donald Trump and after the defeat of Donald Trump, the election of Joe Biden, and a conflictual period of time between the election and the certification and the inauguration, that on January 5th, 2021, I thought in one way and thought there's one response that feels natural. And good. By 5 p.m. Eastern time on January 6th, after insurrectionists attacked the Capitol, funded and fueled primarily by nationalism and its real driver, Christian nationalism, and people broke into the Senate dais and prayed a Christian prayer that would be very familiar in style, content, and words to what you and I would know. That just sort of changed things, right? So now I feel like, boy, a different response is necessary to a set of conditions. And that idea that we live in real moments, in real times, without only a moral certitude that needs to be applied to every situation without context, that's a different project. And feels a little different. Does any of that resonate with how you think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and what you do at the Bonhoeffer Institute, and sort of what the calling is for a person to live well in the world or live faithfully, if faith is what drives them? Is that the way you think about it?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and an even more important observation, especially when you mention certitude, which in my old world was the primary virtue.
Yeah.
Never mind the virtues announced in the Sermon on the Mount, concern for the poor, the lonely, the suffering. It was, you had to be absolutely certain about everything, particularly your own opinion. and that was, the primary virtue. Well, what Bonhoeffer taught me, principally through his correspondence when he was in prison and suffering miserably, and we see him even in a suicidal state in his correspondence with family and intimate friends, was the cardinal virtue of self-doubt, of the abiding question on whether I'm really right or not. And there seems something very healthy about that, to just periodically ask ourselves, am I really right on this? Am I absolutely right? Is there another way of seeing this? And sometimes there isn't. I mean, sometimes it's quite stark. To judge a person's value or to assign a certain level of dignity or indignity to them because of the color of their skin, because of their ethnic origin, because of their national identity or whatever, is always wrong. And that's something I think we can be quite certain about.
Yeah,
it's universal. But I would say those things are fewer rather than more. In other words, there are fewer of those areas of certainty than there are certain situations and opinions. So yes,
I'm reminded of this book that I read way back in the early 2000s when I was trying to wrestle with some of this too, and the book helped me to differentiate between a functional confidence in my beliefs and opinions and sense of the world as being distinct from certainty. And that because I felt like the deal was, well, you're either certain or you're just blowing in the wind. Like you're just wishy-washy and because I was taught this in the Christian tradition that I was in, that those are kind of your two choices. You're either built on shifting sand or you're built on a rock. Like this is the contrast. And this book by someone named Daniel Taylor is called The Myth of Certainty. I had to look it up on Amazon. The Myth of Certainty, the Reflective Christian and the Risk of Commitment. And he really calls us to this modern day notion of a proper confidence in what we hold, which then always has doubt embedded in it as a necessity and as a feature of our beliefs and not a flaw. And that we can replace certainty with something that's not just wishy-washy and I don't know, who knows, why have any moral claim at all, and I can't even say the Holocaust was wrong, right? I mean, that's the stuff I was taught was, hey, if you drop this moral code and this moral certainty, then on what basis do you get to say that anything is wrong? And you know, that at a certain age, and you know, when I was in my early 20s, that felt like a real dilemma. I'm glad that in my 50s, that doesn't feel like such a dilemma, you know, that of course that's not how it goes, but there's something in our human impulse, as you said. So maybe it's our biology. I don't know. Maybe it's just our neural pathways, or maybe it's our culture. I can't separate those out either. It really wants us to ask people how certain we are, or use exacting language. You know, I hear this in media, and you know, some people at the turn of the year, change of the year, new year, they say like, here's things I hope don't exist in the world. And I heard a little radio bit where someone was like, here's words I wish we would just stop using. And I wish people in media and journalists would not ask people a question that involves the phrase, what exactly do you mean by that? Right? I know we sort of mean say more about that, but this exacting language, I mean, it shows up in the pandemic. It shows up in morality. There's something in us that wants something to be so exacting and certain and settled. You would if that's your view of the world, that something's better when it's that way. Well, then anything from God certainly is going to be that way. So there you go. And I know I'm going on and on here about my own philosophical journey, but it feels like it's part of all that.
As we say, preach it, brother.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, thank you, because you just gave me a great response to the next journalist who asks me what exactly I mean. I'm just going to answer, well, I can tell you approximately what I mean.
Can you give me a round shape of what you're getting at? Yeah.
Yes. And there is something very healthy about that. And I think it has to do with humility, how we perceive ourselves in reference to others. And this was the other thing that attracted me to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He defined Jesus, for example, as the one for others.
Wow.
That was the nature of Christ, that he existed, his mission, his purpose, his being was for the other, not for himself.
Nice.
And I talk now often about bringing my fellow evangelicals. I still identify as an evangelical.
Yeah, I do too.
And, that's hard to do these days. There's kind of a bitter acceptance of that identity. What I go back to is the meaning of evangelical, which comes from the Greek euangelion, which we get the word evangel from, and it means good news. It's good stuff. We might even say it's about the common good.
Yeah, right.
About all things good. And so I go back to that. But one of the things I try to do in sort of helping my fellow evangelicals to find a better place is to remind them about the mission, message, and model of Jesus, what he actually said and did, and what his purpose was. And that was for the other, not my best personal interests,
right,
but for yours, and for the sake and well-being of others. We might say for the common good. Do you see a theme here?
Yeah, that's right. Well done. You are a professional. Yeah, I think of the passage out of Philippians, right? This early writing of Christian theology that implores us to do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but to consider others in our pursuit of that which is good. Like that, that's also built in there. And I don't know, it feels like it's sort of these two struggles in humanity that it helps me at least to know that we're in an epic human drama when we're dealing with this, not just a 21st century political religious argument that traditions around the world currently through time, if you look back at whether it's the Christian scriptures, Jewish Christian scriptures, or other traditions scriptures, there are these stories of this battle, of brother fighting against brother and family tearing. Like these are, uh, this is the human predicament we find ourselves in, the human drama with all these multiple responses, and that it's just a different story than there's a moral truth. We should follow that moral truth and execute that moral truth. And if not, well, we all know what's coming. And then everybody fills in the blanks on what's moral and fill in the blanks on what's coming. And do you, Rob, do you feel like you can tell people now in short form the way you could previously how your faith compels you to civic engagement or to broad political engagement or specific political engagement? Like, do you feel like you have that pocket in your pocket statement like you used to have? And if you don't have it, do you not want it? Are you glad you don't have that anymore? Are you glad you have to say to somebody like, well, it's going to take a minute. Like how do you put all this together when someone says, oh, you're involved in some kind of like you and I are going to be involved in a couple of weeks trying to ask the federal government to stop executing people in the United States, stop federal executions, and to ask for states to stop executing people. So we're going to go to Washington, D.C. We're going to make a big claim to people that run the government, make laws, and the Supreme Court. Stop doing this. It's wrong. So you're not done compelling and asking for your federal government, people that will give you an ear, to act in a particular way. But you're doing it differently. So do you have a shorthand way that you describe that, or that you want to describe it?
Boy, that's the first time I've been asked that in this new season of life. And I used to have plenty of well-rehearsed elevator speeches, some that were 30 seconds long and some that were 3 minutes long. I don't have that anymore. And I think I am glad that I don't, because all of these things demand, deserve, require much deeper reflection, explanation. Again, with self-doubt, there's always room to say, I think, but then again, there may be a different perspective on this, and I'm open to that. I will say that, for example, on the death penalty question, one of the things I can be certain about is that we can't revisit errors when it comes to life and death. And that because we may be wrong, we better stop, put pause on everything, look at it, and be extremely careful in our examination and the conclusions that we draw from it about it, because you can't revisit that kind of error. There's a finality to it. And when there is, for example, even in public policy on, supporting children, for example, once a child moves through a developmental phase, and that can be very short, that you can't go back to that missed phase or damaged phase. So we have to be extremely careful about those things. So even when self-doubt is present, it can propel you to a very definite act. It doesn't have to be an indefinite or indecisive posture. In fact, uncertainty can drive you to very decisive acts because you dare not assume that you are right and that all will go well. And I've got to tell you that, in our secret life, one of the things my wife Cheryl often does is kick me under the table and say, "Honey, you're talking too much Bonhoeffer again. Get on to a different subject." Somehow I always get back there.
It's
But one of the things Bonhoeffer again has taught me is the fact that we are all wrong at some point in time about something. I'm going to be wrong. I'm not always right. And somebody asked me the other day, Cheryl and I are about to celebrate, well, we're zooming towards our 45th anniversary.
Yeah.
And
Congratulations.
thank you. A young couple asked, what's your best advice? And I said, well, after 45 years of marriage, probably it's best to learn early to say, I was wrong.
Yeah.
And then stop talking. Don't qualify it. Don't say, but, don't connect it to anything. Just stop at, I was wrong.
Yeah.
And it seems we need to say this collectively.
Yeah, a lot of people think the three most important words in a marriage are "I love you." That's probably true. I was wrong. Also, it's a close second, right? The two might go together. Yeah, and maybe that's a piece of love, right? Like, truthfully, maybe the way we love and even love ourselves, right? Like these same narratives, they reflect back on the things we say about ourselves and the things we do to ourselves, that we have to admit sometimes that we had the wrong expectation, demand, and beliefs to ourselves, and even say to yourself you were wrong, which is really the biggest struggle that a lot of people have. For some people, they don't have a struggle saying they're wrong. That comes easy to them. It's a gift. They're easily there. To others, especially in certain professions or when you're rewarded for certain behaviors and certain confidences, to say you were wrong, like in your old life, maybe you felt this way. I certainly did. To say I was wrong meant in 6 months, you're not going to be able to pay your mortgage. Like it was a moral failing that meant you were going to no longer have the whatever role you currently have. Like there was a lot on the line. And I think for a lot of people trying to make sense about why religious people behave the way they do, there's reasons. Like people are not just irrational and mean. They're narrating a story. I heard you earlier when you were saying, the morality that we have of God is that then the wrath of God's not going to burn against us. There's people who think they're trying to just do the best for America and the best for their neighbor. And the best thing we can do for our neighbor is not to have God move against them. I'm trying to keep God from attacking you. So of course that's because I love you. Like we all construct narratives in which we're the hero fending off some bad narrative. So there's a lot going on about why we behave the way we do in the stories that we tell ourselves. And to admit that you're wrong, that's just that's a sense of like personal and spiritual maturity that we all have to reach, that I'm hoping to get to someday. That just doesn't come easily, or always sit well.
And that makes me just think of our primitive impulses towards survival. And we have many primitive impulses. I look again, one of the great challenges for me, and I think shameful elements of white American evangelicalism today, or evangelical identity, is our embrace of what I call popular gun culture in America.
Yeah.
And people think, you're just, you're mad about guns. What is that all about? Well, most evangelicals will justify their passionate embrace of unfettered gun rights in America based on the obligation to defend one's neighbor.
Yeah.
So, I have a gun to defend myself, my family, and my unarmed neighbor, and that's my moral obligation to him or to her. Well, frankly, I'm of the opinion that is wrongheaded, that's a wrong interpretation of our obligation to neighbor or family or ourselves. But as you're rightly pointing out, there is at least it may be a wrong-headed thoughtfulness, but there's a thoughtfulness
Yeah.
behind that position. And part of our challenge is to affably introduce a different perspective on that and persuade others that, in fact, uh, this may be wrong. And the more closely you look at it, you're likely to come to that conclusion.
Hmm.
So, that's all part of the challenge that's in front of us. You asked me uh, a little while ago, seems like an eternity ago, you can get so much content into a short conversation like this. But, did I have, uh, the short talk on
Yeah.
where I am right now? And this does bring up another component of my new understanding of things, and that is our common humanity.
Mm.
And this keeps going back to our common humanity, that in a way we're all like each other. And one of the things
Mhm.
that keeps me humble these days, I guess, I have, too many haughty episodes, but at least keeps a humble reference point for me, is the fact that I am too much like my opponents.
Mm.
I get into a lot of debates these days, but I could be them because in many cases I was them for
Mhm.
30 years.
Mhm.
And I know I understand them. And I think understanding each other is extremely important to resolving our conflicts with each other.
Mhm.
And understanding at least includes an appreciation for our common humanity, that we're all cut from the same cord or the same tissue anyway.
Yeah, and that is yes, and I'm just reminded again by the all the religious traditions that I know of, especially the Jewish Christian ones, where the story starts in Genesis with the two sons of the Son of God, Adam, the two sons, Cain and Abel, and one kills the other. And I think we're supposed to remind ourselves that even seeing that we come from the same origin, even seeing that we're in the same family, doesn't mean we don't move harshly against one another. That this sort of notion of familial connection, and in fact, even in our own society, we know most violence happens inside of close relationships, not stranger upon stranger. But death, gun violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence is the cause of most of the assaults and harm in our society. So we have to figure out how to create a moral sensibility toward one another that is taking into the assumption that being close doesn't mean we don't hurt. I say this in about, I don't know, way too many of our podcasts, that I am constantly shocked by the notion that, as far as I can tell, humanity is the only species that self-harms, and why we're committed to self-harming. And if we don't get a handle on the willingness to self-harm, harming another who we're close to, it also becomes an option, right? And so anyway, I'm just so perplexed by this human predicament that we're in, and what do we do to live well in the midst of it? That the common humanity is absolutely the starting point of this, and then from there, how do we construct something that is good for all of us? And I don't know that anybody's got the clear answer to it. I'm kind of glad about that we don't just have to reference back to someone who lived at one time and they figured it out. Now we're, like we're walking in a different puzzle than, a different maze than the same maze that they were in, and we can't find our way out. That maybe we have to find another way to sort of live in it. I don't know. I'm really perplexed by that notion.
Well, in this, what I often refer to as the period of my third conversion, and probably not my last, because one thing I've observed, you know, at age 63 and almost 50 years as a professed Christian, and I look back and I say, um, boy, change is just a part of human experience. It is in the whole. I mean, you look at humanity over time. You know, I used to use rhetoric in my old uh, permutation of Christianity, like, you know, things have never been worse. These are terrible times. Nothing can compare. And then you think of the Iceman of the Alps. I forget his name now, but anyway, the 5,000-year-old um,
Yeah.
victim of murder, you know, who was just traversing the Alps and took an arrow to his back, and nobody was ever prosecuted for that crime because it wasn't a crime. There was no criminal code. Well, you know, things were pretty bad. In the period of Reconstruction, you know, when a member of the House of Representatives went over to the United States Senate
Yeah.
and nearly beat to death a U.S. senator on the floor of the United States Senate with a cane,
Yeah.
and nobody, you know, the worst he got was a temporary censure for nearly murdering a colleague
Right.
on the floor of the Senate. Things were pretty bad then, you know, but we're changing over time. And for me, the spiritual life is at least defined in part by openness to
Mm.
change
Hmm.
and to change. You know, as an evangelical, I believe in radical change that
Yeah.
occurs when one goes, as we say, to the altar of repentance and faces oneself and one's own sins,
Mhm.
and confesses that state to God and asks for forgiveness and receives it. This is all part of radical personal change. So for me, this is just a period of personal change, and I think for humanity, a period of change, as always will be the case, which I guess makes me, by definition, a progressive
Mm. Yeah.
because we progress
Yeah.
uh, from where we were. You know, sometimes it looks like we're regressing, and I'd make an argument that even these days it looks like America is regressing. But on the whole, that arc of the universe is progressive. It moves
Yeah.
us forward through change, and sometimes that change is very disorienting and difficult
Hmm.
to articulate, as it is for me. Um, and maybe that's part of the confession that we make, is just, you know, yeah, I wish I could give you a short answer, but I can't because, you know, I'm changing on that, or things are
Hmm.
changing around me. And acceptance of change is a very big part of progress. And these are the things that drive me
Yeah.
now in
Right.
this period of third conversion.
Yeah, I really like it. I've been I can't shake the imagery of a spinning top when I think about these issues. Like, are we progressing towards something better? And at any point, you know, a top will move along a table in a certain direction when you spin it, and any dot on that top will be either moving backward from the direction the top is moving or moving forward. So we sort of have this experience that very Einsteinian view of the world, right? That the relationship of any one moment to another moment may look like it's moving one way, while the larger relationship of that movement to larger relationships are moving in another way. And that's conflictual, right, to the human experience. And we put all that stuff together, you know, we get through our days anyway, you know, and we try to call ourselves forward. And I just keep thinking of your statement earlier that dropping this moral demand that has a consequence just frees up. So I'm basically just to say to people, God is not your enemy and is not the one you should fear. That's the story that got me into Christianity. That God is your protector. God is not the perpetrator that you need to be protected from. Just that statement, for a lot of Christians especially, they feel that God is somehow going to be the judge and the perpetrator of a wrong upon them, or a pain upon them, and Jesus is the protector. And we just do a lot of things in Christian theology, and other traditions have their own work to get to the same conclusion. But in Christianity, we tend to do this thing where it feels as if we're running from God, because if God catches you, you're not going to be, you know, met with a metaphorical embrace. You're going to be met with a metaphorical punishment. And boy, that it's hard to shake that. You say that to somebody, God's going to pay you back. People are like, oh, I know. You say to somebody, God loves you and is already knows and absorbed everything that you've ever felt and experienced and is still totally committed to you. They're like, where do you get that funny business? Well, where does that stuff come from? Like, I don't know. Hey, I just want to reflect on two other things from your story that I've been putting together here. Um, you've mentioned a couple of times how your faith was importantly rooted in the teachings of another person. Early on, it was the teachings of Jesus as your leader. Then you talked about Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan Republican religion, and then Dietrich Bonhoeffer's teachings that in some ways for you, esoteric thinking that sort of comes from Christian tradition, I don't, it doesn't feel like that's what's captured you, that for you, having a person who articulated this story and now accompanies you on the journey of the faith that you're walking on seems like something that you really want, that accompaniment, be it, only Jesus in your early days to this community around Reagan and maybe Ronald Reagan's aura himself, and then Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That feels like it's a feature of the kind of faith that you're in. Have you ever thought about that? Am I just spinning together things that don't really have a connection to each other? Is this something you've ever thought of or considered?
One thing I haven't thought of until now is taking you as my therapist. Doug, you'd make a great therapist. I happen to be married to a psychotherapist,
Okay.
and she offers me a lot of good therapy, but we have to be careful.
You can just Venmo Doug Pagitt when we're done here. That'll be fine. We'll settle up then.
Yeah. You probably make a little more money than you are
I
now.
probably would. Yeah, should probably have a certification to do such thing. Yeah,
but that's a really interesting and worthy question to ask myself, and thank you for posing it. Yes, I enjoy companionship. I don't do well alone. Ask Cheryl that. She knows leaving me alone can even be dangerous. I enjoy the company of others, even if it's posthumous.
Yeah.
So I read a lot of biography, especially historical biography, going back in time. And I like to take, um, you know, role models as companions on the journey with me. Certainly that's true of Jesus. I have a big affinity for Moses. I like Moses for a lot of reasons. He was a deeply flawed character, and that makes him very appealing to me, as are many of the figures in Scripture. And we miss that. We think of them as paragons of virtue, and they are certainly not. They are really messed up characters. And Bonhoeffer, principally, for this period of my life. And yes, I guess I like to see tangibly how people live out their principles. And it's very inspiring to me, but it also moves, concepts from the abstract to the real, and kind of proves that you can do this stuff. You can actually do this. Anyone could have been tempted to say, oh, come on, how could anyone have gone up against the apartheid regime in South Africa, with all of its power and domination, and violence and cruelty? How could anyone go up against that kind of juggernaut? And then, there's Desmond Tutu, who we just lost. And you see the model of that, and of course, many others. But for me, in my religious world, he's a particular role model. So, I look and it convinces me, yeah, it actually can be done. And I want to do it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really great and really admirable. And I like that you do that. Like, I like that your story is here are my faith companions I've had along the way. And there's a teaching by a philosopher named Ken Wilber where he talks about change. And he says, what we're all faced with is that when we go through a change, we have to um, transcend our background, we have to leave it, but we also have to include it in our new version. Because if we don't leave it, we stay stuck. And if we don't include it, then we become bitter. That we have to find ways to transcend and include and to sort of bring along. And that's so much easier for a lot of us when we anthropomorphize or have a real partner that comes along, right? And trying to remember, I've had a rule of my own public engagement that I don't want to ever speak publicly against an idea that I don't personally know someone who holds that idea that I'm going to speak against. Because I don't want, I always want to be able to reference myself to another person who has figured out, because it's not usually what we believe that is meaningful to us in our transformation, like digging into the roots of our beliefs or something. It's getting to the core of what that belief does for us, how it functions in our lives. That's why we keep our beliefs. We keep our beliefs because of their payoff, their contribution to us. And so if you don't get to that, then just the words themselves or the ideas or the notions are easily swapped out for another. But you realize, no, they compel me, they motivate me, they hold me back, they push me forward, they do whatever they do, our beliefs. And to always know that, hey, if you're going to start messing around with someone's belief and start saying it should change, if you don't take into consideration the power that has in a person's life, you're just not being very nice. And I think it's not going to work, right? It doesn't work to engage with someone an idea if you don't care why they hold it or what it does for them. No matter how silly or significant you feel their belief is, it's just not about that. And so for you to articulate like, hey, I embed my faith in the lived experience of partners of mine, faith journeyers, because I want it to also be embedded in my life. There's a kind of common humanity and a human, I don't know how I mean this word, but a humanistic version of faith and belief that's human centric. Like it involves human beings. It's not like people are not just referencing, some abstract thing. It's functioning in a human being's life in a way. And I just find that to be really great.
Well, thanks for the reminder of how important, every part of our life's journey is. And I've tried to preserve that. A lot of people have asked me, do you like totally regret that 30-year period of your life? Like, was that just wasted? Of course it wasn't. First of all, I met fascinating people. I was challenged by many, with good questions. And, so I got to know my opponents during those years and benefited from many of them and still do today. At the same time, there were many allies, colleagues, co-belligerents with me who were themselves studies in human complexity. I love to tell the story of the one guy, one of our major donors who fueled our movement with a lot of money. He was a very wealthy businessman, lived in Ohio, on Siesta Key in Florida, and Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So you get the picture.
Yeah.
And he was a big gun collector. I think he had 300 guns in his principal home. And then he always told me he had a shotgun at an arm's length everywhere he was because he never knew what was going to happen. He was a big supporter of Donald Trump. And sadly, he died of COVID a little over a year ago.
Wow.
And I feel his loss terribly. And I had many, many differences with him in, the short time before his death. But I'll tell you where I met him. I met him and his wife, who was even more conservative and right wing than he was, when they were uh, sweating, literally sweating, cooking pancakes in a dusty ranch church kitchen for a sanctuary full of Hispanic pastors, many of whom were undocumented migrants in this country on the uh, southern border, the Texas border. And they were literally serving them, cooking up breakfast, taking it out on plates, and serving these Latino pastors meeting in this, decrepit church
Mm.
building on a ranch in South Texas. You know, not
Yeah.
everybody is a stereotype.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to appreciate that. And I draw those memories from my experience so that I can get the best from it because they were not wasted years.
No, they're not. No, yeah. Well, Rob, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you for that story. Thanks for all your good work. Just plug for those who want to join us in a couple of weeks on January 16th and 17th. We're going to be in Washington, D.C., raising our voices around the call for our federal government to stop executing its citizens. I'd like to extend that to our government to stop killing people in totality. I think it's one of the things that government shouldn't do. But certainly through the death penalty and the abstract legal system that we use to do this. They can join us there. And of course, the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute is doing all kinds of programming and resource creating and sharing. And people can follow you on all of that. We'll put the links in the places where the links go and all of this. So thank you. And I would welcome you here anytime and look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Likewise, I'll be there or I'll be square, as we used to say in the 70s.
And apparently still say today. I like it. Yeah, that's good. All right, my square friend. I will see you over at a circle somewhere.
I'm looking
all right, all y'all. We'll talk to you tomorrow.